As part of my resolution to lean into the more historical episodes, I have been doing a series recently on the channel under the shorts called War on the Delta, all about the Creek War, which was part of the War of 1812. The Creek Indian War began and mostly took part in and around the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, the same delta that a few hundred years prior had seen the first real warfare between colonials and indigenous when DeSoto took on Chief Tuscaloosa. Here we were again, colonist versus indigenous people. What had happened at Mauvilla had now repeated itself at Horseshoe Bend. And it would repeat itself again at Sandy Creek, and the Trail of Tears, and Bear River, and Wounded Knee, and Fort McKenzie, and the Brazos River, and Bloody Rock. I'm your host, Stu Donald. Let's head to the Delta. The Creek Nation in the early 19th century was made up of two main factions, the Lower Creeks and the Upper Creeks. Both part of the Muskogee Confederacy, Lower Creeks was the name Europeans gave to the villages of the Chattahoochee River Basin and the Lower Tallapoosa River region. Upper Creeks referred to the villages of the Upper Tallapoosa and Coosa Rivers. The Upper Creeks were also known by another name, the Red Sticks. The name derives from the red-painted war clubs they carried in battle. While the Lower Creeks endeavored to coexist and even assimilate with white settlers, the Red Sticks resisted colonization. Their paramount chief at this time was Maniwa, a military leader of mixed race, Creek and Scottish. As a matrilineal society, power and prestige fell with the mother's lineage. Another prominent Creek chief, also of mixed blood, was William Weatherford, Red Eagle, a member of the powerful Wind clan. Both men were staunchly against the encroachment of white settlers, which would eventually put them at odds with the Lower Creek. The growing conflict between the two factions would have a grave effect on the forming of this nation and the way indigenous people would be treated by the American government. As we discussed in Part 1, the Creek Nation in the early 19th century was made up of two factions, the Lower Creeks and the Upper Creeks. The phrase Lower Creeks was coined by Europeans to describe the villages of the Chattahoochee River and the Lower Tallapoosa River region. The Lower Creeks endeavored to coexist and even assimilate with white settlers. They were led by a mixed-blood chief, William McIntosh, also known as the White Warrior. McIntosh was a chief of the Coetta tribal town and commander of a mounted police force. A major divide in the Creek Nation formed when McIntosh and other Lower Creek elders signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, which ceded much of the remaining Creek lands to the U.S. This was a violation of Muskogee law and carried with it a death sentence. The treaty was not honored by the Muskogee Creek National Council, and soon dividing lines were drawn within the tribe. The Treaty of Indian Springs was the first step in a long and complicated journey that would lead to America's greatest crime, the illegal Indian Relocation Act of 1830, which ultimately resulted in the Trail of Tears. To some, Andrew Jackson is the father of the Democratic Party. Others call him America's Hitler. He was born in the Waxhaws Wilderness that straddles the Carolinas just weeks after his father's death. His poverty led him to enlist in the militia at just 13. Joining the Revolutionary War, he would first show the grit that earned him the nickname Old Hickory. He defiantly refused to polish the boots of a redcoat officer and was rewarded with a sword slash that left him scarred for life. After the war, Jackson studied law and opened to practice in the frontier town of Nashville. He springboarded that into politics, being elected Tennessee's first ever House representative. With another war against the British looming, Jackson was appointed a major general in the Tennessee militia. He began running campaigns against the British allied Creek Indians, which ultimately culminated in Jackson's bloodthirsty victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, during which Jackson instructed his soldiers to save bullets by simply bashing their enemies' heads with their guns, which they did to nearly every man, woman, and child in the village. This was but the first of many atrocities Andrew Jackson would wreak on America's indigenous people. From Red Eagle's tombstone, the son of a Scotch trader, Charles Weatherford, and a Creek Indian princess, Sohoy Tate Weatherford, William was destined to become one of the most powerful leaders of the Wind clan of the Creek Indian Nation. During the early 1800s, conflicts, usually over land, between the Creek Indians and the white settlers erupted into open warfare. After having led his warriors in the attack on Fort Mims in August of 1813, he was known to have grieved at the viciousness of the attack. Over 500 white settlers, men, women, and children, and several hundred Creek Indian warriors were killed in this historic battle. Andrew Jackson and his 2,000 Tennessee volunteers defeated the Creek Indian Nation led by Red Eagle in March 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. As we will learn, this is far too brief a summary of the life of this man. Weatherford would only become known as Red Eagle posthumously, after he was the subject of the heroic poem The Red Eagle, a poem of the South by Alexander Beaufort Meek, published in 1855. In middle school, we were taught that the Creek Indian War began on August 30th, 1813, when 700 Red Stick, unprovoked, massacred 250 Americans at Fort Mims. We were lied to. The Red Stick War, as it is called by the Creek, actually began on July 27th at a bend on Burntcorn Creek. The Red Stick were peacefully enjoying a midday meal when they were laid upon by the Mississippi militia, a force numbering 170 soldiers. This sneak attack surprised the Red Stick and sent them fleeing into the nearby swamps. Thinking they had won the day, the troops began looting the Creek's possessions. However, the Red Sticks gathered themselves in short order, now catching the militia off guard. The troops frantically retreated to a nearby hill. Their commander got lost in the swamps and wandered there for 2 weeks before being rescued. In actuality, Fort Mims was retaliation for Burntcorn Creek. Hey y'all, subscribe for more. The rationale for why the Mississippi militia attacked the Red Stick at Burntcorn Creek is because they had learned that they had just acquired firearms from the Spanish in nearby Pensacola. Apparently, they forgot that the Second Amendment also applied to indigenous people, so they went off half-cocked, so to speak, to attack the creek, and they did take them by surprise, but then were quickly and embarrassingly routed. According to encyclopediaofalabama.org, the militia's embarrassing defeat at Burntcorn Creek was satirized by Lewis Sewall's poem, The Last Campaign of Sir John Falstaff II, or The Hero of the Burntcorn Battle, written in response to a dispute that Sewall had with Captain John Collier, who led the militia. In the poem, Collier is compared to Shakespeare's cowardly and incompetent character Sir John Falstaff, and with Cervantes' delusional Don Quixote. For the Red Stick, victory at Burntcorn Creek was not enough. There must be retribution for the attack. Tensions between the indigenous tribes of Alabama and Mississippi Territory and European colonists and settlers had been on the rise since the early 1800s. In 1811, fire kind of got stoked after a visit by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who was trying to build his confederacy, the Muskogee Confederacy. That kind of got things going, and that started a bit of a civil war between the Upper Creek and the Lower Creek. The Red Sticks were the ones who retaliated for the attack at Burntcorn Creek, and they did so at the plantation home of Samuel Mims, about a month after Burntcorn Creek's attack. According to encyclopediaofalabama.org, it was on August 30th of 1813 that a force of about 700 Creek Indians destroyed Fort Mims in present-day Baldwin County. In so killing 250 defenders and taking at least 100 captives in what is considered the first major battle of the Creek War of 1813 and 1814. Some 400 American settlers, U.S. Allied Creeks, and enslaved African Americans had taken refuge inside a stockade hastily erected on the plantation of Samuel Mims. A wealthy resident of the Tensaw district of what was then the Mississippi Territory, the Creek attack on Fort Mims, and particularly killing of civilian men, women, and children at the end of the battle, outraged the U.S. public, thus prompting military action by the Creek Nation, which controlled what is now most of modern Alabama. A force of 700 Red Sticks, led by William Weatherford, who at the time was known as Four-Off Warrior, as opposed to what he'd be known later as Red Eagle. And they were also led by the prophet Paddy Walsh. They rushed through the fort's open gate at noon. Half of the surprised 100-man garrison of Mississippi Territorial Volunteers died with their commander, Major Daniel Beasley, in the first few minutes of the battle. Captain Dixon Bailey, a Creek, and his 45 American and Creek militiamen repelled the Red Stick onslaught for 4 hours, successfully defending hundreds of civilians huddled inside the flimsy 1-acre stockade. Only when the attackers set the fort's building ablaze with burning arrows did resistance collapse. Red Eagle said that his greatest regret was that he was not able to control the ferocity with which the Creek exacted their revenge for Burntcorn Creek, and as it turns out, it would have long-lasting repercussions at the end of the war. Y'all subscribe now, you hear? According to encyclopediaofalabama.org, the attack on Fort Mims and its civilian inhabitants, many of whom were of Creek ancestry, outraged Americans and immediately changed the course of the war. Red Sticks followed up their attack on Fort Mims with smaller attacks against nearby Fort Saquonfield. American retaliation for the attack on Fort Mims was loosely but ineffectively coordinated by a series of American military commanders, notably General Thomas Flournoy. But Battlefields.org adds, Tennessee Governor Willie Blount directed the commander of the state militia, Major General Andrew Jackson, to mobilize a force to suppress the Creeks. Authorities in Georgia and Mississippi also planned offensive, but the main effort would be led by Jackson. Woodsmen from across the state showed up to join Jackson's army, including young Davy Crocket, who was one of the first men on the recruiting lines. Crockett enlisted at Winchester on September 24, 1813, as a 90-day volunteer in Captain Francis Jones' company of Tennessee Volunteer Mounted Riflemen. He left his wife Polly and their young children at his small farm 10 miles south of Winchester. My countrymen had been murdered, and I knew that the next thing would be that the Indians would be scalping the women and children all about there. If we didn't put it to a stop, he recalled in his memoir, the truth is, my dander was up and nothing but war would bring it right again. Jackson's force was made up of a militia comprised of 1,000 Tennessee volunteers and was supported by 1,300 cavalry commanded by John Coffee. Their objective was to attack the Red Sticks among the Abaca towns. By November 3rd, Jackson secured the first American victory in the war when Coffee's cavalry routed Creeks at the town of Tolosahatchee, killing 200 Red Stick warriors as well as a number of women and children. Davy Crocket was the grandson of Antoine de Saussure-Pirouet de Crocketin, a French Huguenot who migrated to Ireland in the mid-1600s, and it was there that he changed the name to Crockett. Although Antoine never ventured out of Europe, his son John did, immigrating to the American colonies. According to Davy's memoirs, John was either born in Ireland or on the voyage to America, although his birthplace is listed as Virginia. At the start of the American Revolution, John moved his family to the newly opened Washington Territory, now East Tennessee. In 1886, Davy was born there in East Tennessee and lived in a number of communities where he built a reputation as a hunter and a storyteller. Crockett enlisted for the Creek War in Winchester in September of 1813 as a 90-day volunteer in Captain Francis Jones' company of Tennessee Volunteer Mounted Riflemen. He left his wife Polly and their young children at his small home south of Winchester. Jones' company soon joined Major General Andrew Jackson, where Crockett served mostly as a scout and a hunter. Jackson's force, which was made up of 1,000 Tennessee volunteers and supported by another 1,300 with the objective to attack the Red Sticks among the Abaca towns, which ultimately concluded at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River. Jackson's tactics with the natives there did not sit well with Crockett, who elected to terminate his enlistment and headed home to Winchester. Crockett would eventually fall into politics, where his homespun humor and folksy mannerisms would see him elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he would once again ally himself with Andrew Jackson, now President of the United States. But the alliance would again falter over Jackson's malevolent treatment of indigenous people. Crockett opposed Jackson's 1830 Indian Removal Act and was the only member of the Tennessee delegation to vote against him. At its passing, Crockett abandoned politics, but made an impassioned farewell address that ended with, "You can all go to hell. I'm going to Texas." We know how that ended. The Creek Indian War was a war within a war. The War of 1812 had already broken out before the hostilities that began at Burtcorn Creek. But there was also a correlation between the two, as the Red Sticks, the Upper Creek, had allied themselves with the British and the Spanish, and the Lower Creeks had allied themselves with the Americans. So in effect, the Creek Indian War was also a major component of the War of 1812. In fact, after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Andrew Jackson would go on to lead the American troops over the famous Battle of New Orleans. The War of 1812 is often thought of as the forgotten war, but what came out of it from an artistic standpoint was two of the greatest songs in American history. Francis Scott Key's The Star-Spangled Banner, and then later on, the folk song, The Battle of New Orleans by Johnny Horton. Y'all subscribe now, you hear? Andrew Jackson's force entering the war was a game changer. In November of 1813, there were 4 clashes between the Red Sticks and the militia, all won by the U.S. According to warhistoryonline.com, vengeance for Fort Mims came on the 3rd of November. Future President Andrew Jackson, leading the United States forces, ordered General Coffee to advance on enemy forces gathered at the town of Tallustahachie. Coffee surrounded the town, and when the Red Sticks advanced, he forced them back among their houses. The natives refused to surrender, and 168 were killed. Not all natives sided with the rebels. A few days after Tallustahachie, a messenger reached Jackson telling him that 150 friendly natives were besieged at Talladega by 1,000 Red Sticks. Jackson marched his force upon the town and defeated the besiegers, killing nearly 300. Jackson's tactic of withdrawing in the center might have been more effective had some of his men not fallen into a real retreat. Captain Sam Dale, who was wounded at Burkhoard Creek, was one of the most notable American soldiers of the war. On his return to action in November of 1813, he led an expedition to look for Red Stick raiders. Dale's small force was attacked while crossing a river in what is now known as the Battle of the Canoes. Dale and a dozen of his men were trapped alone on the bank they had been leading. Red Stick warriors attacked his party from the woods, and others came at him in a canoe on the river. Dale and his men captured the canoe in brutal close-quarters fighting and completed their crossing under fire. And on November 29th, General Floyd tried to imitate others' success by surrounding and destroying a native force at the town where it was based, this time at Atuese. Unlike Coffee, he failed to surround his target. Though American troops won by using artillery and cavalry, the remains of the native force were able to escape. Floyd, low on supplies, had to withdraw, harassed by the surviving natives. The Holy Ground was a New Creek town on the eastern bank of the Alabama River. Though fortified, it was not able to stand against the forces under General Claiborne that attacked them on the 23rd of December. The natives, led by Red Eagle, were well prepared and managed to evacuate in the face of the American threat. Uneven ground prevented an effective pursuit, and Red Eagle himself escaped by leaping onto horseback from a high bluff, landing in the river, and swimming across. This would be the last battle of 1813. Y'all subscribe now, you hear? With the new year, the war resumed. Jackson again went on the offensive, but the Red Sticks, led by William Weatherford, Red Eagle, were up to the task. According to warhistoryonline.com, after Christmas, Jackson began an advance whose results would be disputed by the opposing sides. He claimed success, while the natives claimed to have driven him off. The first encounter of this campaign took place on the 22nd of January, 1814. Near the fortified town of Emukfa. Rebel troops fell upon Jackson's column before it could reach and assault the town. Fierce fighting on the American right proved to be a feint by the natives, who fell upon and almost pushed back the American left. Solid work by Jackson and by Coffee, commanding the right, held the line, but while they held the field, they never reached Emukfa. After Emukfa, Jackson began a retreat towards his base. The Red Sticks attacked him at Enotochopka and were again driven off, allowing him to complete his retreat. Jackson had held the field twice with far fewer losses than his enemies, but he had been driven back, a dent to American confidence. On the morning of the 27th of January, Red Eagle led an assault on Americans under General Floyd at Calaby Creek. Attacking silently out of the swamps under cover of darkness, they caught the U.S. soldiers by surprise, forcing them onto the defensive. But when dawn came, Floyd was able to organize his troops and swing his flanks around. They nearly surrounded the attackers, and Red Eagle withdrew. Like Jackson, Floyd had the battlefield victory, but the strategic loss. His confidence was broken and he withdrew. With no skirmishes in the month of February, the table was now set for the final battle of the Creek War. Y'all subscribe now, you hear? Few men in history, including the Founding Fathers, have had as much of an impact on shaping America as Sam Houston. He was the hero of the Texas Revolution, exacting revenge for the Alamo and leading the Texian army to victory at the Battle of San Jacinto, sending Santa Anna running back to Mexico with his tail between his legs. He was the first president of the Republic of Texas, the first to represent Texas in the United States Senate, and the only person to be elected governor of two different states, Texas as well as Tennessee. He is the namesake of Sam Houston University and the fourth largest city in the nation, Houston, Texas. Not bad for a teenage runaway who spent 3 years living with a Cherokee. In 1814, Houston served General Andrew Jackson, joining the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He fought alongside Davy Crocket and was one of the first Americans to cross the log barricade and engage the Red Sticks in hand-to-hand combat. During the battle, Houston caught an arrow near his upper thigh, a wound that would plague him the rest of his life. He had it removed and bandaged, then returned to the fight. He was struck again with bullets in his shoulder and arm. General Jackson took notice of Houston and began mentoring him. Houston would never waver in his devotion to Jackson. Early on the morning of March 27, 1814, 1,000 Red Sticks, under the direction of Chief Miniwa, were beginning their day in the fortified village of Tohopeka. It had been several weeks since the last major skirmish between the Creek and the American forces, led by Andrew Jackson. That would change before noon. Jackson divided his 3,300-man force into two prongs. He sent General Coffee's 1,300 militiamen, along with a number of Lower Creeks and Cherokee, on a wide flanking maneuver that would cross the Tallapoosa River and surround the Red Sticks, while Jackson launched what would be an ineffective artillery barrage. Jackson was forthcoming in his respect of the Creek's defensive strategy at the village located in the Horseshoe Bend of the Tallapoosa River, saying, "It is impossible to conceive a situation more eligible for defense than the one they have chosen, and the skill with which they manifested in their breastwork was really astonishing." Coffee's men soon traversed the Tallapoosa, where they quickly liberated the Red Sticks' canoes. With escape by water eliminated, Coffee then ordered Colonel Gideon Morgan's Cherokee Regiment to attack the town itself. Coffee's charge was just the distraction Jackson needed, so he quickly ordered the 39th U.S. Infantry to initiate a bayonet charge. Colonel John Williams led the assault, accompanied by Lieutenant Sam Houston. As soon as the breastwork was breached, the hand-to-hand engagement quickly turned into pure carnage. Women, children, and the infirm were brutally dispatched without conscience, bashed to death by the butts of rifles in order to save ammunition. Jackson's sociopathic hatred of Native Americans was unleashed in an onslaught of brutality. When the dust settled, 800 of 1,000 Creek warriors lie dead. Several were shot to death while swimming the river to safety. A few were able to escape. Among the survivors was Chief Miniwa, who was wounded 7 times during the battle, but miraculously escaped after playing dead until nightfall, crawling into a canoe and floating away on the Tallapoosa. On August 9, 1814, the thoroughly beaten Red Sticks signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson, ending hostilities and forcing the Upper Creeks to hand over 20 million acres to the U.S., essentially half of what is today Alabama. Davy Crocket did not participate in the massacre and returned to Tennessee. With the rebellion squashed, Jackson, Houston, and the rest of the force set their sights on New Orleans for a fateful showdown with British forces. Y'all subscribe now, you hear? Several of the players in the Creek War are names of great import to modern historians. Most every American knows of Davy Crocket, Sam Houston, and Andrew Jackson. Others who played just as large a part are now lost to modern audiences. Miniwa remained active in Creek politics, continuing to oppose European American encroachment on Creek lands. He died on the Trail of Tears. William Weatherford moved to a farm in Lower Monroe County where he would marry and raise 5 children. He became a statesman where he used his influence to negotiate a peace treaty. He died in 1824 and was buried near Little River. Houston and Crockett's lives would parallel each other as both men would embark on careers in politics and both would play a part in Texas independence. Both men are also etched in American folklore. However, Samuel Dale has kind of been lost to people. His name historically is the Daniel Boone of Alabama. In fact, it was Dale who was known for the buckskin suit and coonskin hat. Disney would have you believe Crockett and Boone wore. Now, when an individual uses force or the threat of force to obtain something that does not belong to them, we call it armed robbery. When a government does it, we call it manifest destiny. The only difference is the number of people affected. Plurality does not affect morality. Society's greatest crimes have been committed for the greater good. The Tuskegee experiments, Prohibition, the Trail of Tears. The fallout from the Creek War can still be seen today. Jackson's victory at Horseshoe Bend was the first step towards the Indian Removal Act, the first steps towards his presidency. Jackson's supporters always blamed his hatred of indigenous people on them killing his grandparents. However, history does not support that charge. It was British loyalists who attacked Jackson's family, killing not his grandparents, but instead his father. Jackson did adopt a Creek child named Lincoln, but it was mostly for political show, as he would send him off to boarding school. Jackson's Indian Removal Act was actually struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, who declared it unconstitutional. But he ignored the ruling and illegally carried out the removal, on which some 6,000 natives died. An act of treason that preceded an act of genocide. To learn more about America's Amazon, the Mobile Tensaw Delta, be sure to subscribe to Delta Safari.